Yes, so today I want to outline the shape and arguments of the book Small is Necessary, Shared Living on a Shared Planet that I'm completing here at the Rachel Carson Center. But before I do, I'd like to emphasise that I deeply appreciate this opportunity to work amongst other passionate environmental writers, to have the space to focus on my work away from everyday hassles and distractions, and to talk about the writing process with other scholars whose preoccupations and styles sometimes coincide with mine, but just as often are stimulatingly different. I'm indulged because the language of the centre is my mother tongue. I admire all of you who write and speak in English, even though it is not your first or favourite language. Finally, in an increasingly hostile, intolerant and segregated world, I salute institutions such as the Rachel Carson Center for keeping the candle of internationalism burning, because without such solidarity, there is no hope for us. Just having a bit of trouble here. There we are, good. So my book addresses an aspect of environmental waste and degradation of Earth's precious non-renewable energy and unsustainably harvested resources. Buildings, specifically household dwellings, are the source of around 30% of world carbon emissions. This graph shows how humans' collective ecological footprint started to outstrip Earth's regenerative capacity in the late 1960s and continues to climb like a mountain. I see the challenge of creating more sustainable practices within our houses, households and apartments in an historic context, one that enables us to speculate constructively on preferred futures where housing is sustainable and community-oriented. Moreover, I see this challenge as an activist who has experimented with alternative collective ways of living. I live now in a rural town with a significant number of sustainability-oriented people and activities, and I work in the centre of one of the two largest and busiest capital cities in Australia, Melbourne. RMIT University is known for its design, technology and practical policy-focused research. The manuscript that I'm working on is as much about sustainable household practices as it is about sustainable housing. It argues not only for small dwellings in compact, dense settlements, but also for shared spaces and facilities as a natural complement to small, making less more. It is about us actively housing ourselves more affordably and sustainably, rather than lobbying and relying on governments or pleading with building developers to provide the kind of housing we'd like. Beyond the right to housing, a right to the city, and a right to environmental justice, it's about a right for us to act in our own interests, in solidarity and collectively. The book has 10 chapters, including the bookends of an introduction and conclusion. There are 3 parts, essentially taking an historical point of view first, second, looking at significant current cases, and third, the future. An historical view shows that the average size of new dwellings, after gradually rising earlier in the 20th century, ballooned after World War II. And I'm writing this book for a British publisher with a worldwide English language readership. So I look almost exclusively at developments in the UK and Europe, North America, Australia and New Zealand. Data for these countries show that the construction industry has promoted a market for bigger houses and apartments that banks have been prepared to finance by way of hefty mortgages. Among the countries that I'm reviewing, Britain alone, which is, Britain alone, which is in this column here, and this is the size of houses. So it's got an average size house of around 7 squares or 700 square feet, whereas you can see in Australia it's well over 2,000. So you can see the inequity in the housing that's actually provided for people through the market. At the same time, it has, that's Britain, like in the rest of these countries, become increasingly costly to buy or rent a dwelling there, especially in London. Adding to the per capita cost of housing and to its increasing environmental sustainability, household sizes shrank during the 20th century. So, for instance, in Australia, despite the fact that the house size has grown, in 1911, the average household was 4.5 residents, and now 100 years or 4 generations later, households on average only have 2.6 occupants, trending downwards to 2.5, the estimates are. So these statistics illustrate general trends in all the countries which I look at. To make housing more sustainable, regulators are insisting on better environmental standards for housing, typically using rating systems. Architects are maximising passive solar design. Builders are making dwellings more airtight, insulating them, double glazing windows, and installing efficient water and energy services to homes. Planners are promoting apartments in well-serviced, compact urban settlements with green spaces to encourage people away from detached housing in suburbs where they rely on cars for transport. Munich's quite a good example of this. Initially, environmentally sustainable housing was more expensive, but as it has become more mainstream rather than a niche market, sustainability improvements have become more cost effective. Still, housing in general is not cheaper. In fact, in many cities, it's grown more expensive this decade. House sizes diminished just a little after the global financial crisis. It was a crisis actually triggered by unsafe mortgage lending by banks and widespread mortgage defaults and eviction. But conventional households remain small. In short, despite improvements in environmental standards of dwellings in all the countries I've studied, the size of buildings and its contribution to overconsumption has not been addressed. Most significantly, current data shows little improvement in the sheer size of carbon emissions attributable to the housing sector. Now, arguing for smaller housing is like population control. It's unpopular. So a subtler approach has been followed by planners to argue for apartments, and that's the subject of the first 2 chapters in part 1. The first outlining the long history of apartments from Roman times. And apartment development has been characterised on the one hand by well-located large and serviced apartments for the wealthy, and on the other hand, overcrowded, unhealthy and tiny housing for the poor. The environmental, social and economic limitations and potential of apartments was clear very early on, to be replicated across geographies and multiplied as industrialisation and urbanisation both expanded and contracted. Today, population growth and movements, demographic changes in household types and environmental imperatives all offer new opportunities and cast new shadows on apartment developments in capital and global cities. For instance, up to 1/3 of Earth's urban residents, 1 billion people, mainly living in megacities of the global south, live in tiny apartment-style dwellings in overcrowded slums. The last chapter in part 1 looks at small, neat and central apartments constructed in varying styles throughout the 20th century, including utopian designs for apartment living and micro-apartments, say 20 square metres or 200 square feet in size. Micro-apartments make environmental and economic savings, but they heighten individualisation. They suit 1 to 2 person households best and multiply all the minutiae of kitchens and bathrooms and laundries per capita. And the same can be said of the tiny house movement. This leads to the conclusion that collaborative housing, which developed bottom-up in reaction to unaffordable, unsustainable and individualistic mainstream housing in the last decades of the 20th century, has the most to offer in terms of environmental sustainability, affordability and community. So part 2 looks at a range of collaborative living models from a house or apartment that's co-owned by, say, 3 non-related people, land that's co-owned by 2 to 4 households who each build a dwelling on it, through to co-housing in attached dwellings and apartments, and eco-villages that include productive farming, co-working to achieve a major degree of collective sufficiency. Collaborative housing not only involves sharing housing space and facilities, but also activities such as eating meals together, doing gardening and maintenance, and caring for one another's children. I focus on outstanding eco-cohousing and eco-village models, drawing on independent evaluations of their environmental efficiency. I draw too on the community's own records and other reports on all kinds of aspects of collaborative living, from governance to internal diversity, social and financial models. Both eco-housing and eco-villages economise on personal space in modest private dwellings to the benefit of well-used communal spaces and facilities. For instance, a co-housing project might have 25 attached and small private dwellings with a common house, with a big kitchen, function and guest rooms, common laundry and workshops. Earthsong Eco Neighbourhood in New Zealand has 32 dwellings whose households share just 4 lawnmowers. They share their open space with the local community and for environmental education and campaigns to plan more ecologically friendly suburbs. Now, I make a key distinction between co-housing, which mainly fits into mainstream planning, building, and even social housing models, and eco-villages that started in the 1980s with clear missions to incubate a new, more sustainable form of living and working. Both co-housing and eco-villages involve participatory design. In other words, their communities have a much greater say in the floor plans, the style and materiality of their dwellings than someone buying a house in the open market. Now, they have more opportunities for self-building and other forms of sweat equity and co-financing that make them more affordable. Beyond needing to collaborate with all kinds of stakeholders in developing their housing complex, co-housing and eco-villages develop neighbourhood governance principles and processes that build personal and collective skills in grassroots democracy and consensual decision-making. Self-management enables and encourages residents to be more environmentally sustainable. I argue that all these socio-political skills in co-governance will be critical in creating sustainable futures. Indeed, Part 3 is about such futures. Chapter 7 reviews government initiatives and responses to small models of collaborative housing through to co-housing and eco-villages. It is ironic that neoliberal reforms have actually meant that collaborative housing is more attractive to governments wanting to economise on social welfare funding. Co-housing has become a particularly attractive model for accommodating seniors, both separately and in intergenerational projects. Especially here in Germany, with the emergence of entire co-housing neighbourhoods, progressive cities are successfully zoning and calling for public-private partnerships to create co-housing in urban developments. In the 1990s, I lived at Round the Bend Conservation Cooperative on the peri-urban edge of Melbourne, which, along with the Bend of Islands Conservation Association, covering another 100 privately owned neighbouring properties, successfully campaigned local and state governments to proclaim their area an environmental living zone for low-impact living with conservation-oriented regulations, a planning zone's precedent for use elsewhere. The concept of low-impact living aims to create a relatively seamless inhabitation of land and water with as minimal disturbance of natural landscapes as possible. Based on varying levels of collective sufficiency, self-management, and environmental and social values, low-impact living is pursued through approaches such as permaculture and a do-it-ourselves mutual support, moving beyond housing to embrace livelihoods. Lammas eco-villages struggled with planners and planning legislation, contributing to the groundbreaking Welsh One Planet development policy, which only allows rural development exceptions where 75% collective sufficiency can be achieved by a settlement within 5 years. Each dwelling and plot measures around 5 acres or 2 hectares. In October, a Lammas home featured on Kevin MacLeod's British TV series Grand Designs. The straw bale and timber home required only £27,000 worth of materials, although it cost another extra £5,000 to feed the 277 volunteers assisting in its build. MacLeod endorsed it, and I quote, as how we could and should live, unquote. Now, the Lammas 2015 annual report showed that this settlement was living well within a One Planet footprint in Wales. Through efforts associated with their work, play, homes and travel, residents had an impact around 1/3 of the national average. This required neither smart high-tech nor total retreat from advanced technologies like the internet. They simply minimise use of things, including machinery, water and energy. The One Planet development practice notes of the Welsh Government read, and I quote, "One Wales, One Planet has an objective that, within the lifetime of a generation, Wales should only use its fair share of the Earth's resources, with its ecological footprint reduced to the global average availability of resources of 1.88 global hectares per person, the global availability of resources in 2007. And they end, this is a very challenging but necessary target, unquote. In these ways, governments have been pressured by citizens to acknowledge regulatory responsibilities for curtailing emissions. Chapter 8 traces the long history of architects and the short history of developers responding to interest in collaborative housing by profitably selling community and sustainability-oriented packages. Really a contradiction in terms with an uncertain future. So this chapter explores allied developments such as Airbnb, co-living and co-working, sharing networks of second-hand goods and community food production. All these kinds of initiatives are often referred to as sharing economies or sharing cities, which are misnomers in as much as they're not yet holistic interlocking economies, but rather a series of disparate enterprises and activities that advocates hope will one day change capitalism or even create a post-capitalist future. Finally, Chapter 9 reviews ground-up developments where groups of people have come together in an occupier style to form typically eco-villages independent of the state and the market. Drawing on rich socialist, feminist and anarchist traditions, but with a primary contemporary concern to address climate change through radical innovations, frugal and convivial living. These kinds of settlements can be as large as thousands of residents and as long-standing as with Christiania, the now semi-autonomous free town in Copenhagen. But many, like the United States income-sharing rural Twin Oaks and New York Gannis, have around 90 to 100 residents. Twin Oakers are around, say, 80% collectively sufficient and independent of the market. Established in 1967, Twin Oaks has, and I quote, values of cooperation, sharing, non-violence, equality and ecology, unquote. Their income-sharing commons benefits from past accumulation of farming land and forest, equipment, housing and people skills and knowledge. For taxation purposes, Twin Oaks is categorised like a monastery. In fact, it's a secular culture. Members have diverse beliefs and philosophies, but they follow the simple living and collective sufficiency of a traditional monastery. Governance is non-hierarchical, with committees, managers and planners making and operationalising everyday management decisions. Members work an average 42-hour week on domestic tasks and businesses in return for their basic needs being met. They get around $1,200 per annum pocket money. Besides washing and cleaning, working with timber, gardening, childcare and preparing food, they produce communal cash-making tofu, hammocks, they index books and grow seeds for heirloom plants. Some political activities are deemed work. 7 large group houses, clothes, communal meals, equipment, a fleet of vehicles, skills, knowledge and spaces are shared. Bikes lie or sit in stands around the farm. You pick one up, use and leave it there for someone else to take. Second-hand bikes are repaired and maintained in a workshop. Non-work activities include musical groups, theatre, reading and film groups and cafes. Vegetables are organically grown on 3.5 acres. They're harvested and walked to the kitchen. So food transport and refrigeration costs are negligible. A herd of cows provides unpasteurised milk, cheese, yogurt and beef slaughtered on site. They have chickens, an orchard and they dumpster dive. Heating is from passive solar, locally harvested timber and solar hot water. So energy efficiency produces major savings. Joining members can only bring as much personal property as will fit into their small bedroom. Members' assets owned outside Twin Oaks remain theirs, but for as long as they live there, the income earned from assets goes to the community. And this is the most straightforward and fair communal arrangement of which I know. So, part 3 really suggests 3 alternative drivers and scenarios for the future of small and shared housing and living. And any conclusion really ends up as a series of questions. The most significant questions are, will the future development of eco-collaborative living end up being mainly government-led by planners, community development officers and social welfare agencies? Alternatively, might markets, professional architects and developers find eco-collaborative living a new area for social and profitable enterprise? Or will we witness a world where self-provisioning, collectively sustainable resident citizens develop neighbourhood control, leading to complete system change, a real and permanent transition to much more affordable, self-built, community-oriented and sustainable forms of living?